Hey everybody, it's PartyElite, and today we're taking a look at the new lores of magic that were just revealed for Total War Warhammer 3. In a separate video, we'll talk about some of the bigger changes coming to magic in the third game too, but stick around to the end of this one for a quick conversation about the little DLC faction tease in this blog post, and in quite a few of the previous blog posts as well actually. Now, if you're interested in more Total War Warhammer 3 coverage on the channel, make sure you hit that like button and leave a comment down below letting me know. Now, with the game tapping into the Chaos Wastes and the gods themselves, you can imagine a greater focus on the winds of magic and all the trouble it can bring, and that seems to be exactly what we're getting. Each of the Chaos Gods, except for the magic-loathing Khorne, gets their own lore of magic. Then there's the Lore of Ice and the Lore of Tempest for Kislev, and the Lores of Yin and Yang for Cathay. Among the lot, there are some really interesting new effects from spells. We've already seen the Missile Reflection in action, and I'm glad to see there's much more freshness coming through. With no time to waste, let's begin. The Lore of Tzeentch is kicking us off today with a quick look at some new status effects and a new format for representing information too. It'll take some time getting used to, but damage types, in this case armor piercing, are represented in percentage format now. In this particular case, my understanding is that 30% of the 13 damage per second is armor piercing. While 30% of 13 is easy mathematics, it's not as easy as just having the number to read, right? Like, why not just put down the number 3.9? Anyway, like I said, it'll probably just take some getting used to, but I can't help but wonder why the change was made. But moving on from the slight confusion there, let's get to the meat of it. The blue fire of Tzeentch is a magic missile that hits a single target, and when overcast, it comes in with some increased armor-piercing damage. The phrasing here suggests that the regular cast causes at least some armor-piercing damage too. The pink fire of Tzeentch, meanwhile, is a breath spell that doesn't make mention of armor-piercing, but it does apply Warp Flame to everything it touches, and that reduces armor and increases weakness to fire by 11%. It also causes some damage, with the overcast simply applying more damage. Warp Flame seems like a solid tool on the battlefield. I can imagine not a lot of lower tier Tzeentch units being armor piercing at all, but they probably pack magical and fiery damage. That reduction to armor paired with the increased weakness probably goes a long way, but whether this spell, with its likely limited range, is the best way to apply said status effects is yet to be seen. There are other options. Treason of Tzeentch is an area hex that lowers leadership within the area of effect, and the overcast version of the spell will drop melee attack stats too. Depending on just how much it drops leadership by, this could be a super powerful tool to break weak-willed enemies. Demons will cause leadership damage with fear and terror, and a properly timed cast of Treason of Tzeentch can help break a flank or a backline. Naturally, anything with immunity to psychology will be a less valuable target, but coming in from the flanks and the rears, causing decent damage while dropping a spell like this? Any unit that isn't unbreakable might struggle to stick around, depending again on that leadership damage that comes from the spell itself, of course. Glean Magic is a hex of the winds, and it increases your own army's power recharge speed and reserve pool while decreasing the enemy's. It lasts longer when overcast, but I wonder what happens if your opponent has already used up all their winds of magic. And what happens if your opponent doesn't have a caster in their army? And what if you're up against something like the dwarves, when that, inevitably becomes an option? This really plays up Tzeentch's influence over the winds of magic, and I quite like the idea, though its existence definitely raises a couple of questions in those specific cases. Tzeentch's Firestorm is a vortex spell that causes fire and magical damage with a touch of armor-piercing damage as well. It lasts 17 seconds, has a radius of 7 meters, and moves at a rate of 4 meters per second, meaning it's not a stationary spell. But the description on the blog makes it sound like 3 pillars that move within the target area, so it might be a bit more predictable than some other vortex spells out there. It hits targets with Warp Flame on top of the damage it deals, and we already talked about how that can be a valuable asset, and the Overcast version deals more armor-piercing damage too. Finally, the Infernal Gateway is another vortex spell, this time stationary, causing a great deal of damage as a portal to the realm of chaos opens up, sucking in nearby soldiers. Overcast, it deals more armor-piercing damage, and this is going to be one of those spells that'll get a lot of use, I think, especially in single player when the AI blobs up real nice. It's going to be a pricey one to cast though, but I'm really excited to see it in action. Both this and Tzeentch's Firestorm will probably also have the good old formation disruption to them. They'll pull people around, slow them down, throw them around. It's always those nice extras that come with a Vortex spell. Now, a lot of focus on dealing armor-piercing damage in particular with the Lore of Tzeentch, with one Hex spell that targets leadership and another that targets the Winds of Magic. I can see Treason of Tzeentch being especially useful at shutting down peasant archers with the help of, say, Furies, and it can also come in handy just breaking parts of melee lines too. We'll know more when we can actually see the numbers, of course, but between the armor-reducing effects of Warp Flame and all the armor-piercing damage out of just magic alone, and the inclusion of the Lore of Metal in the Tzeentch roster, I'm definitely seeing some patterns. The Lore of Slaanesh is up next, our first proper glimpse at the God of Excess. Of course, the first spell we're looking at involves a whipping instrument. The Lash of Slaanesh is a breath spell that seems to deal armor-piercing damage on a regular cast, and even more so when overcast. Acquiescence, meanwhile, is a hex that decreases the speed and melee defense of a single target unit, with the overcast version causing a greater reduction to speed. We're looking at a spell that can break charges on the defense, or at least reduce their efficiency, and on the offense, they can help pretty much pin an enemy unit in place. It's no net, so it won't literally pin them in place, but depending on how much it slows a unit down by, it should give enough time for you to cause a fair bit of damage to, say, a lord that's trying to escape, or a cavalry unit that's just overreached. Without much information on the Slaanesh roster, we can't be sure exactly what kind of units one might pair with this, but the ability to slow the enemy down can come in handy regardless of what you're fielding and what you're up against. The reduction in melee defense can also really tip the balance of an engagement in your favor, especially if you're chasing down a potentially threatening enemy unit that just overreached. Hysterical Frenzy is the one augment spell of the bunch, buffing melee attack and armor-piercing damage on a single unit while applying the Rampage attribute. Overcasting increases the armor-piercing damage by a greater degree. This one's got a catch to it with a Rampage status effect there, sort of a buyer beware kind of a situation, but it definitely fits that passionate Slaaneshi angle. I really like seeing a spell that kind of has a bit of a catch to it. Again, there's no better way to put it, and I hope to see more things like this with other Lores of Magic and just future mechanics in general. I love seeing the gamble mechanics, the ones where there's a bit of a risk that comes with a reward, and this is an excellent example of that. Pavane of Slaanesh is a direct damage spell that reduces melee attack of a target unit as well, with the overcast version lasting for longer and thus causing more damage as a result. There's no indication on if this is a direct damage spell that works best on individuals, units with lower entity counts, or units with higher entity counts, so we'll have to wait until we can go snooping through the game files before we can actually tell. But, with that said, causing direct damage while also reducing melee attack is pretty big. You're really weakening some possibly high-tier units. I'm thinking again, lords or heroes, and then if you're able to kind of pin them down, slow them down with some of the other spells and just surround them and prevent their escape, you could deal a lot of damage while minimizing their own efficiency. Pretty interesting tools here. Slicing Shards is a bombardment spell that causes both ranged and explosive damage, caring little for armor. It claims to have a large strike area, and with an overcast version, we see increased damage. The description sounds like it won't be like some of the more recent bombardment spells we've seen that kind of home in on their targets. I love those, but this one sounds like it'll just pop in the air and hit whatever's beneath it at the time. Finally, Phantasmagoria is an area hex that drops leadership while also pinning units in the cast area, and overcasting it makes it last longer. Pinning a unit in place has countless benefits. Not only can it help literally stop a charge in its tracks, but it can prevent an enemy unit from escaping as well. Where Acquiescence can merely slow units down, this can hold an enemy in place, pinning it down for whatever deeds a Slaaneshi cultist might pin somebody down for. I think I might get demonetized if I go down that line of thinking. The drop in leadership is of course a pretty big deal as well, so as we discussed earlier, if you mix it with terror and fear with a couple of flanking charges, even the most steadfast of warriors might give up and flee. It's nice to see a couple of hexes here, and an augment with a bit of a catch too. I was hoping to see Tzeentch live in this world as well, focused on hexes and augments more than damage dealing, but Slaanesh feels like a nice balance with not just one, but two ways to control the speed of enemy attackers. Again, that kind of control really feels more Tzeentch to me, but maybe I'm mistaken. Either way, I do like the balance that Slaanesh has. I'm trying not to get too distracted by my personal favorite god here, but as you can imagine, it's a little challenging. I do think those Slaanesh will be fun, with those 2 hexes on the battlefields especially, and once we see some actual numbers, I'll be curious to see what the role the Pavane of Slaanesh plays with its direct damage classification. The Lore of Nurgle has some really interesting mechanics alongside some suitably predictable ones. I mean, come on, stuff with regeneration we saw coming from several miles out. But first, Miasma of Pestilence is a hex that reduces melee attack and charge bonus, with Overcast upgrading it from a single unit target to an area target. Depending on the amount of those debuffs, a well-timed Miasma of Pestilence can possibly nullify even the most powerful of charges with a reduction to charge bonus, and a drop in melee attack just furthers said nullification. I'd almost like to see it reduce melee defense instead, basically robbing the charging enemy from damage output while also making them an easy target, forcing the enemy to do a bit of sort of risk assessment before giving a charge order. Again, I love when strategy games involve a bit of that, gamble is what I'll call it, but truly it's risk assessment. Do you push that charge with a certain unit early on, have it get hit by the Miasma of Pestilence, or do you push in some weaker charges first to bait that Miasma out and then come in with your heavier hitters, Anyway, I like that kind of thinking, and I feel like switching it from a reduction of melee attack to a reduction of melee defense would maybe encourage that a bit more, because you're sending a, again, heavy-hitting unit in, and if it loses its attacking efficiency by dropping its charge bonus, and it also reduces its melee defense, which is already pretty low on heavy cav, it's in for a harsh time. So I think that might be interesting, but it's too early to make judgment calls like that, obviously. I'm sure melee attack works nicely as well, and it ultimately nullifies the attack power of these heavy hitters. They won't melt away as easily as if melee defense was dropped, but it's still an interesting concept, and I do quite like the spell. Now, moving on from that, let's take a look at the Stream of Corruption, a breath spell which applies poison to all enemies that it hits, presumably, of course, for 10 seconds, applying a significant number of debuffs alongside some damage. Overcasting deals extra damage, and I can see this being a pretty handy breath spell for once. Poison causes some tremendous debuffs, and a well-timed hit with this bad breath can easily turn the tide at the front line before those lines even meet. So very curious to see the exact numbers on this one as well. Curse of the Leper is an augment that adds armor and damage reflection to a unit, while overcasting it increases the value of both. That makes it sound like damage reflection on the base spell reflects a base percentage, and the overcast version reflects a higher percentage. It's pretty cool to see that this whole damage reflection aspect has been added in the Lores of Magic here, and I wonder exactly how that damage reflection might best be utilized and how best it might work. Would you rather, for example, eat a charge with its full charge bonus with damage reflection on? Does damage reflection reflect that charge bonus damage? Does it also reflect things like armor sundering and rampage and poison and magic and fire? Does it reflect the damage status effects? Like if you get hit by frostbite, but you have damage reflection going, does the attacking enemy get hit by frostbite instead? Does it get hit by frostbite as well? Is reflection a pure reflection? Or do you eat the damage and reflect it as well? I've got 1,000 questions that this blog post here has got me raising, but it's a cool idea. I absolutely love it. And having these kinds of questions is what gets me really excited about this kind of stuff. I'm curious to see how that damage reflection works and where it's best used. Again, do you pop it when you're about to eat a charge? Do you wait until a spell's about to be dropped? Like, what happens? Does the caster eat the damage reflection that's coming in from a spell cast? So many questions. I'm sure we'll get answers soon enough, but this mechanic has me extremely excited. Moving on from that though, Rancid Visitations is a direct damage spell causing 10 seconds of 67 to 133 damage per second, lasting longer and as a result dealing more damage when overcast. I wonder, again, and as always, if it'll be best used against a single entity, a low entity count unit, or a high entity count unit. Blight Boil is an explosion spell with a nasty name, with the Overcast version causing more damage, and Fleshy Abundance is the regeneration spell that greatly replenishes hit points of a target unit, with an Overcast version healing multiple units within an area instead of just a single target. I'm really pleased with Nurgle's selection of spells here. Between things like damage reflection and charge bonus reduction alongside status effects like poison and regeneration, it's really interesting and it feels very support heavy. There are some damage dealing spells too, sure, but it definitely feels more about supporting your troops rather than causing damage with the spells themselves, like say, the Lore of Tzeentch that has a magic missile, a breath spell, and 2 vortex spells. Also over here, just in my script, I wrote it down as a breath smell, so clearly I'm in a Nurgle mind state over here. God, the Nurgle spells just sound absolutely abhorrent. The Lore of Yin is up next, and it raises some interesting questions as well, with one spell in particular. I love having these questions because it means we're getting some really juicy new stuff, it gets me so excited. First up though, we've got the Storm of Shadows, a hex that greatly reduces the speed of a target unit, with the Overcast version targeting an area instead of a specific unit. Again, we know the utility this can have, massively turning the tide by preventing the enemy from being as aggressive as they want, or otherwise preventing their escape from a precarious situation. The Cloak of Jet gives units Snipe, Stalk, and Unspottable traits, allowing them to sneak up on and flank or fire upon the enemy with relative safety. Overcasting increases the duration of the cast, and I'll be curious to see just how much use the War Machines and Gunners from Cathay can get from this. I expect you can't actually cast this on flying units, so you're not going to have hot air balloons floating across the sky with the enemy unable to see them. That would be interesting, but I highly doubt that'll be an option. You're much more likely to pop this on your gunners, sneak them into position, fire in from flanks, or pop this on your cavalry perhaps, send them around the flanks as well, unspotted, unhindered, charging in when the time is right. An interesting spell. I love these kinds of spell. You very rarely, I think, get to see them in action, but when you do get to see them in action, in the hands of pros especially, it's some beautiful stuff. Blossom Wind is a wind spell that hits units with the blinded status effect, while the Overcast version deals additional armor-piercing damage too. Blinded can be absolutely huge as far as the stat damage it causes is concerned, and if this wind spell goes down an entire front line, you'll make an absolute mess of the enemy, potentially just before lines meet, and that would be where it's especially potent. The 10 seconds of Blinded will then help whittle down what's left of the poor front line, and I imagine this will have a long cooldown timer, or at least be fairly pricey to cast, but since it's right down the middle of the list here, I'm not sure, because I assume these are listed from cheapest to most expensive on the blog post. Maybe the damage it does won't be all that much after all, and maybe you're mainly relying on the blinded effect that it brings instead. Missile Mirror is a hex spell that we saw in action when Cathay was being shown off, and here we can see its stats. It lasts for 18 seconds, and for that duration, it just straight up returns projectiles to sender. Now, okay, we saw it return shots from some pink horrors, I believe, in that one trailer. But what happens if there's a piece of artillery firing at your units? Does that return to sender too? What happens if it's a missile barrage? It looks like rather than targeting a unit to protect as an augment, you're targeting an enemy unit to hex. In theory, in multiplayer, this just becomes 18 or so seconds of that unit not being able to fire. A fast player in multiplayer will just hold fire for those brief few seconds, and while it'll hurt their damage output, at least it won't cause damage to their own unit. The AI, I'm almost certain, won't be so clever, but yeah, what happens, hypothetically and inevitably, if you get the chance to cast it on Queen Bess, or a Necrofex Colossus, or some other artillery piece or equivalent? How does it affect a solar engine? I have so many questions. What counts as reflectable range damage? I have so many questions, I don't even know how to ask them. Curious to see how this works. It's a very cool sounding spell. Even when we caught a glimpse of it in that one trailer, I was immediately like, hey, this is the best thing coming from this trailer. We see a new type of spell, and it's very compelling. And even now, getting some answers, brings more questions. I'm very curious to see how this applies outside of your regular projectile, outside of bullets, bolts, and arrows. And I guess magical flaming bolts that are flung through the air as well. What happens if you use it on something like Queen Bess? We'll see. We'll see in due time. It's a cool spell, and its overcast version lasts longer, and it also gives a longer casting range. That means your caster can be kept further away from danger, which is probably a pretty good idea. Now, you're trying to use this on enemy ranged units, so you're trying to hit their back line without necessarily engaging their front line, so that extra distance can make a world of difference, I imagine. Talons of the Night we saw in action as well, and turns out it's a vortex spell. The description calls it an icy wind rolling across the battlefield, but unless I'm missing something, it looked a lot more like giant dragon feet. The overcast version simply deals more damage. Ancestral Warriors is the last spell in this lore, summoning a unit of, you guessed it, Ancestral Warriors. Strong, halberd infantry that degrade over time by virtue of being summoned. As halberdiers, they'll likely be anti-large and armor-piercing, and since they're a ghostly summon, I suspect minimal armor, some physical resistance, and magical damage as well. Overcasting extends the casting range, and I can see these guys being handy in shutting down enemy cavalry or flyers that get a little too adventurous. Hold them in place with a rear charge that causes fear and possibly terror, because these are spirits, and they might break or kill the enemy. Otherwise, use them to protect your back lines if the enemy gets, again, a little adventurous and tries to shut down your archers and your gunners. You can pop some of these Ancestral Warriors, pull out those halberds, and defend said archers or gunners against, what could it be? Furies, cavalry, monsters, something like that, so that anti-large armor piercing will come in handy. Quite versatile. A pretty fun lore overall, in fact. The Missile Mirror sounds undeniably fun, and I always like spells that allow for sneaking around, like Cloak of Jet. And once we see the stats on these Ancestral Warriors, we might have a pretty powerful summon on our hands too. Again, it's listed at the end of the lore on the blog, which tells me it's pretty expensive, so it's gotta be pretty valuable, right? The Lore of Yang kicks things off with a Jade Shield, a ward save that greatly increases damage resistance on a single unit, with the overcast version increasing its duration. Dragon's Breath is a breath spell that applies fire damage, with overcasting dealing additional damage. Wall of Wind and Fire is, as predicted, a wind spell. The regular cast is a slow-moving wall of fire, presumably causing fire damage considering its name and description, and overcasting adds armor-piercing damage on top of it all. As with all wind spells, even slow-moving ones, this has the potential to melt lines before they meet, and even after. And if it causes fire damage, it will work especially so against any units with regeneration, or those that are otherwise susceptible to fire damage. Stone Guard Stance is an area augment that increases mass and leadership on a unit, and gives them the Expert Charge defense trait. Overcasting influences a larger area. This would be a solid spell to protect flanks or even your center against a monstrous charge especially. Taking that oomph out of an enemy's first charges can make a pretty big difference, though I do wonder how likely we are to see this in multiplayer. In single player, the AI will charge its horses and monsters right into your spear tips anyway too, but still, the added mass will stop units from being flung around a bit better, presumably, and it would stop said cavalry and monsters from getting through your front line. It's an interesting spell, again with an interesting little extra element to it, and I'm curious to see just how it'll work. Might of Heaven and Earth is an augment that gives a targeted unit flaming magical attacks with increased melee attack, base damage, and armor-piercing damage as well. Overcasting buffs these stats even further. It's pretty self-explanatory where this will work best: against anything with physical resistance, against anything susceptible to fire damage, and in general, as a way to cause more damage all around. Higher melee attack stats mean higher hit chances, and if each landed hit is also causing more damage, whether armor-piercing or not, this is basically a spell that can be used pretty much always, depending on its cost, of course. Constellation of the Dragon is an explosion that causes a touch of armor-piercing damage, 16 points to be exact, with a radius of 20 meters. Overcasting causes the spell to deal more armor-piercing damage. I don't know if that means it causes more base damage as well, or if it just changes the ratio between base and armor-piercing damage. Either way, depending on how quickly the explosion pops, it could be very helpful in dropping damage on a clump of units, or otherwise disrupting lines as you go charging in. The Lore of Ice has been seen in action during the Khorne vs. Kislev battle, but let's go over all the spells here as well, just to keep it all in one place. I'll throw all the spell stats on screen from that previous build for this one, but do keep in mind that these are from a build that's quite a few months old now, so take it all with a grain of salt. The numbers, the actual mechanics, everything, especially considering the new Ice Sheet stats from the blog post are completely different. It drops speed and charge speed by 25% each and works over an area, affecting all units within that area. I really like the idea of this spell. Again, something that can really take away from an enemy charge if you catch it at the right time, and on the flip side, it can be used on the offensive too, slowing down an escaping enemy, allowing you to gun it down as it tries to escape. And at a cost of just 4 winds of magic, it's dirt cheap too. Ice Maiden's Kiss is a breath spell that hits units with the Frostbite debuff, with overcasting causing extra damage. Again, this is different from the info card from the old build, but I do wonder if that 12 damage per second is here to stay, or if that's been changed too. Now, Frostbite can really slow a unit down, so you've got 2 ways to use this spell. On the defensive, slowing an enemy unit down, making sure you can cover any gaps, and on the offensive, shutting down any attempts at escaping. Again, you're going to hear that a couple times, you already have in fact. Frostblades is an augment that buffs a unit's weapon damage, armor piercing damage, and melee attack stats, while imbuing them with magical attacks as well. Overcasting bumps these numbers even higher, and again I think it's pretty self-explanatory where you might want to use this. Death Frost is a direct damage spell, with overcasting causing more damage. Now, is that because it lasts longer, or because it causes more damage per second over the same duration? I guess we'll find out later, but either way, the efficiency of direct damage spells, in my opinion, really depends on how it spreads the damage. I'm curious to see if it's, again, best used against smaller or larger entity count units, but time will tell. Crystal Sanctuary is an augment that freezes a friendly unit in place, but greatly increases its damage resistance. It's an interesting catch here. Being stuck in place is a huge risk, but there are many cases where you're going to be stuck in place anyway. When a melee engagement is going down, you're not necessarily going to be pulling your units back, and if it's right at the start of the engagement, neither unit is likely to break either. So, used right when lines meet, this could make a huge early difference to an engagement with that damage resistance, and maybe tip unfavorable odds in the caster's favor instead. Another opportunity to use it, of course, is if your unit's been pinned down by a net spell, you just hit it with Crystal Sanctuary, it's pinned in place anyway, but now it's got that damage resistance, so you've kind of, turned the tables on your enemy, that Uno reverse card being played real hard there, by saying, you want to pin my unit? Fine, I want to pin my unit too, but now it's got this huge buff to its survivability. Either way, when overcast, it goes from targeting a single unit to targeting all units within an area instead, possibly helping an entire flank become much more powerful, much more capable of surviving uncertain odds. Finally, Heart of Winter is probably one of the more complex spells in how it works. It's just an area direct damage spell, and from the build a few months ago, it was super effective, lasting over multiple phases, getting stronger, and slowing enemies down more and more within the area significantly. Overcasting increases the numbers even further as each stage progresses. This is a really fun spell, it's visually impressive as well, and again, it's a little hard to say based on that old build because it was really stacked against the AI. It was made extremely easy so that people could win without any fear of, the shame of defeat, I suppose. So it's really hard to use that old build as a benchmark of any type. So I guess it's a little unfair for me to say it's a very effective or powerful spell, but I I did like how it worked back then. So hopefully they balanced it nicely and they found a sweet spot and they haven't weakened it too much or anything like that, because it was really impressive to look at, and it's interesting as well. It's a complex spell, it lasts over multiple phases, getting more and more intense before it kind of withers away. Honestly, again, another pretty fun lore. I'm curious to see how it gets used on the battlefield to prevent enemy reinforcements from arriving in time. It's got so much sort of speed-based play over here, where it's pinning friendly units in place, it's applying frostbite, it's slowing people down. So it's got a pretty interesting set of tools over here, and I'm curious again to see just how they get used. The Lore of Tempest is rounding us off as our second Kislevite lore. First up, Gust of True Flight is an augment that increases the range and accuracy of a target unit, with the overcast version influencing units within an area instead. With a range-heavy army, God knows Kislev has some really cool ranged unit options, this could be a really big difference in all phases of battle. Greater range and accuracy on artillery can be huge, but just being able to fire bows or guns sooner and more accurately can whittle the enemy down nice and early, well before lines meet. A few rounds of focus fire can punch a hole right through even high-tier units, and with armor-piercing bullets, that applies to anything that doesn't have physical resistance pretty much. Hailstorm is a bombardment spell that hits a medium-sized area with explosive projectiles, and an overcast lasts longer and brings more projectiles. Again, it doesn't sound like any of these, home in on the target types, but one that's best used when the enemy is all clumped up and stuck in. Swiftwing is an area augment spell that gives a boost to speed and charge bonus, with the overcast version hitting a larger area of effect. Again, this type of spell has two uses, the obvious one being on the offense, trying to get more out of a charge or trying to catch the enemy out of position, but on the defensive, it can be used to avoid getting caught out of position yourself. The boost to speed, depending on just how much it is, can be quite a tactical advantage. Biting Wind is another wind spell, and the way things are phrased, it sounds like the base spell causes both armor-piercing and regular damage, but when overcast, it causes more of each. A long column, this will be effective against a straight line of troops, and we've definitely seen wind spells be effective in multiplayer and single player alike, so I'm curious to see these timings on the cast and just how much hurt it causes, because if it's quick to pop, like the icon goes down on the battlefield and within a second the spell is active, it can be very difficult to react to. But if the icon's on the battlefield for a couple of seconds, very high tier players will be able to respond to that, they'll be able to pull back, and they'll be able to basically bait the cast and waste a bunch of winds of magic on their opponent's side. So very curious to see how quick to cast these wind spells are, not just this one, but the other ones we've talked about as well, because that will determine just how powerful a tool it is in multiplayer, at least. In single player, I mean, the AI is the AI, we'll see how that plays out, but I'm pretty sure in single player it'll have value. In multiplayer, we'll find out. Hawks of Mishka is a randomly moving vortex that deals damage and hits enemies within its grasps with a discouraged status effect, causing a decent drop to leadership that lasts about 10 seconds. Throw a couple of bears into the mix from a flank or two, and that leadership drop, coupled with the damage, could do quite a bit, but with unpredictable vortex spell paths, it's always hard to know until we can see just how much they move around. Blizzard is another vortex spell, and this one brings frostbite and damage over a large area, with the overcast causing extra damage. Again, the slowdown and all from frostbite is great, and it looks like 3 damage per second, 100% of which is armor piercing, happening for 15 seconds on a regular cast, but it does look like this is actually a stationary vortex spell, which is perhaps the most important thing to point out. We saw Tzeentch's Firestorm display its movement speed on its stat card, and we don't see that info here, which would imply that it's stationary. Those are a fair sight more predictable, so this could be pretty useful, though at a cost of 18 winds of magic and a near minute-long cooldown, it's pretty pricey. Overall, a decent-looking Lore of Magic as well. 2 augments and a bunch of damage dealing. I don't know how likely the latter are to appear in, again, multiplayer, but it's really too early to say for any of these without actually seeing how the spells move and what kind of numbers they deal. Again, how long it takes to go off, how much reaction time you have available, etc., etc. But the bonus range and accuracy from Gust of True Flight could be really big for Kislev, and Swiftwing on some bear cavalry can crash through lines pretty easily, I imagine. Finally, to wrap the LORES blog post up, there's a casual hint again about the Ogre Kingdoms and their own brand of magic. Whatever CA is cooking up for them, I'm sure it'll be interesting based on what we've read here today. But just a quick something that's been on my mind for some time. I was going to make a separate video investigating this possible line of thinking, and that might still be happening, but I really wanted to get the thought out here today because it's been festering and I can't help myself anymore. Is it possible that all this teasing and just blatant showcasing of the Ogre Kingdoms is actually telling us that yes, of course, the Ogre Kingdoms are in the game, obviously, but it's sort of diverting our attention from the real DLC faction, the Chaos Dwarfs? Think about it. What if the Ogre Kingdoms are implemented like Bretonnia was, able to be played in battle but not fleshed out for the campaign map until a later date. Still there on the campaign map, but not playable until that later date. Meanwhile, surprise, we're getting the Ogre Kingdoms in battle for multiplayer, and we're also getting the Chaos Dwarfs at launch as the pre-order DLC. Do I think it's super likely? I don't know, maybe a 50-50 chance? I think it'd be real clever on their part, and it would explain some of the rosters we've been seeing if they're secretly actually working on a whole other additional faction for launch. It would also explain why they're pretty much giving away the fact that the Ogre Kingdoms are coming at launch. Surely they want to keep a surprise up their sleeves, right? Surely they've got something tucked away. Now again, crazy theory, I know, but they've just been so blatant about the Ogre Kingdoms that they must have something tucked away, right? Anyway, I'll take my tinfoil hat off now and just say that the new Lores of Magic seem to be quite interesting. There are some new mechanics in here, and once we see them in action and see some actual numbers, we'll be able to judge their viability more clearly. Vortices and wind spells work great in single player with how the AI likes to clump, but in multiplayer, again, we'll see. I hope you enjoyed this peek at the spells coming with Warhammer 3, and if you want more Total War Warhammer 3 coverage on the channel, make sure you hit that like button down below and leave a comment letting me know. Don't hesitate to subscribe for more, and as always, a massive thanks goes out to all of the channel members and patrons who've been supporting the channel on a monthly basis. Y'all keep us alive and running smoothly, and of course, a big ol' thanks goes out to each and every one of you for watching. Until next time, cheers.